Good evening and welcome to the third and final Strom lecture of this spring of the year 2000. I'm Paul Burstein. I'm a professor in the Sociology and Political Science departments as well as in Jewish Studies. And it's a special privilege for me to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Goldscheider tonight. My wife and I have known Calvin and his wife for something over 20 years at this point. And we've had the pleasure of hosting them for the last 9 days. We've had the opportunity to have the pleasure of their company as well as their learning. So it's been a very, very wonderful experience. Tonight, the third lecture, as I'm sure you will remember, last Monday, Calvin spoke on the subject of the future of contemporary Jewish communities, Israel, America, and Europe. And I think it's fair to say then he had his sociology hat on, maybe a little bit more than his Judaic studies hat. He talked about the transformation of Jewish communities and how, contrary to what some people think, Jewish communities are actually successfully transforming themselves, growing, and thriving. Wednesday was a little bit more the Judaic studies hat than the sociology hat, a slight shift in the texts he was referring to. Moved on to the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, to talk about how Jewish communities, the Jewish community in biblical times, was based to a considerable degree around voluntary sacrifice, voluntary building of community, and yet voluntary constrained by the Jewish community and Judaism itself. Tonight, for his final talk, and I must say, I don't know anybody, I don't think there's anybody in the United States, maybe not in the world, who could bring together such disparate views of the Jewish people and Jewish futures. So I'm looking very much forward to hearing his final talk tonight, Secularism, Religion, Ethnicity, and Assimilation. Please.
Before I begin, I want to just take less than a minute to publicly thank the Strom family, Althea and Sam, for their generosity and their vision in organizing this set of lectures, which has placed the University of Washington and the program in Jewish Studies on the map internationally. So we thank them both, and I'm pleased that they're both here. I personally want to thank Naomi Sokoloff, the chair of Jewish Studies, for organizing and this event and for inviting me, and for Paul Burstein and his wife Florence for inviting me, and their family for hosting me, and my wife Fran. I am indebted to him and to them for their graciousness. I want to thank as well Lauren Paxton, who administers and organized this in a way that made it very easy for me to function. And I also want to thank the University of Washington for hiring Sarah Stein, who was an undergraduate at Brown, and as a new faculty member here is a major coup for them. And there are many other people that I would like to thank, and I thank you all for being patient and coming back. Some of you coming back for 3 times. You must be gluttons for punishment. So I will try as much as possible to accommodate you. Okay. The Jewish community has constructed for itself 3 compelling arguments about the Jewish past and present, which inform forecasts about the Jewish future. These have been based in part on social science theories and have gained legitimacy in the Jewish community in America and around the world as a basis for policy formation, a research agenda, and strategic planning. These arguments are consistent with a set of ideological orientations current in the Jewish community over the last century. Somewhat oversimplified, the arguments are as follows. The first argument is that Jewish communities have moved over the last century from communities based on religion and religious activities to secular communities. In modern, open, voluntary societies, Jews, like others, have become more secular, less attached to religious activities, religious institutions, and a religious way of life. Whatever religious orientations our grandparents and great-grandparents had, we have fewer of them. Religion is simply less central in our lives today, so it is argued. Judaism, the religion of the Jew, has become secular. This is the secularization argument. A second argument focuses on the ethnic or peoplehood dimension of identity. Jews in the past, so the argument goes, had a distinctive sense of being a people apart from the Christian and Muslim society where they lived. Being a minority meant the lack of access to opportunities and discrimination in everyday life. That was the minimum impact of minority status. However, with increasing openness of society, political rights, expansion of economic opportunities, and the acceptance of Jews in society, the ethnic component has diminished. As other immigrants, Jews have assimilated into Western society, have accepted their new position, and been accepted by others. As generational distance from ethnic origins increases, most American Jews do not have grandparents who experienced living outside of America. The ethnic distinctiveness of American Jews has faded as Jews have become thoroughly American. So the second argument suggests that ethnic identity recedes and ethnic assimilation occurs. A third argument follows directly from the secularization and assimilation arguments and combines the first two. It argues that as religious identity weakens and ethnic identity fades, the Jewish community weakens. What remains, therefore, is the need for external stimuli to ignite the dying embers of Jewishness. Maybe some cultural ethnic attachment and pride in a new nation state like Israel, some rejection or some recognition of Jewish vulnerability to external forces that threaten survival. Thus, as secularization diminishes the Judaism component and assimilation decreases Jewish ethnic identity, few internally generated Jewish values or Jewish culture are available to sustain a community. As Judaism and Jewishness fades, so the argument goes, nothing beyond externals can form the basis for the future growth of Jewish communities outside of the State of Israel. These three arguments, I submit, are challenged by a systematic body of evidence. They do not describe the paths Jewish communities have taken in modern, open, pluralist societies. The dichotomy between religious and ethnic identity is not useful among Jews compared to other groups. Jews are not simply a group other than Protestants and Catholics, Mormons, or Muslims. Jews are not simply like Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Hispanic Americans. Nor is the dichotomy between religious and secular clear, since Judaism incorporates the secular, and there are multiple paths between religious and secular identities going in both directions, religious to secular and secular to Jewish. The distinctions between religious and secular, ethnic and religious, also do not characterize institutions of the community. As synagogues and temples have diversified their activities to incorporate the ethnic components, and secular ethnic institutions have often stressed sacred themes. How do we make sense, then, of the historical changes? How do we get beyond the current arguments about decay that cloud our assessments of the future to new understandings and therefore new visions of the future? I'm going to start with education. One of the core values of our contemporary American Jewish culture is education. The proof of that assertion is that American Jews are the most educated group of all ethnic and religious groups, the most educated among all Jewish communities around the world, including Jews in Israel, and the most educated of all Jewish communities ever in recorded history. Quite a feat, given the low levels of education of the American Jewish community 3 to 4 generations ago. A high educational level reflects both the value that Jews place on education and the educational opportunities available. Over 90% of American Jewish young men and women go on to college. They're children of parents, mothers, and fathers who've also gone on to college. Men and women of both generations, along with their siblings, who are college educated. This fact of higher education has been documented in every study we have carried out, and indeed is an exceptional and distinguishing feature of American Jewish communities. Now, there's both irony and paradox associated with this distinctive feature. Isn't it ironic that the distinctive Jewish emphasis on education is not translated into high levels of quality Jewish education? Isn't it ironic that the Jewish value of education results in the success of educational values that are not at all Jewish? Jews are satisfied with no less than the maximum general education for their children, although they express satisfaction with the minimum level of Jewish education available to them. Indeed, Jewish educational time is almost always displaced by the more highly valued general education. At a time when communal funds are pouring into improving Jewish education and subsidizing Jewish educational experiences and developing creative Jewish educational materials and curricula, the exposure time of Jewish children to formal Jewish education seems to be shorter, and the long-term benefits of Jewish education called into question. Unlike the major successes of secular educational attainment, Jewish education seems to have suffered a decline, a clue that's often used to show the decline in Jewish culture. Yet, and this is puzzling, some young Jews seem to be obtaining a better Jewish education than ever before, even as there are others, perhaps the majority, who are not sufficiently educated Jewishly to make a difference in their lives and in their values. A generation ago, there were almost no scholar-in-residence programs in synagogues and temples, very few scholars, in fact, in America who could share their research and insights. Now there are hundreds of these events around the country every year, exposing many thousands of adults and families to forms of Jewish education unheard of in the past by a wide range of teachers and scholars. So something has happened, but assimilation is not an apt description of these processes. There's an additional paradox. The secular educational attainment so distinctive among Jews and derived from Jewish values is not only un-Jewish in content, but is viewed by some as the source of assimilation. Better educated Jews, so it is often argued, are exposed in colleges to secular or Christian values, influenced by Americanism, meet non-Jewish persons who they marry, and as a result become less Jewish, more assimilated, and over time are lost to the Jewish community. So the circle is complete. Distinctive Jewish values result in high educational attainment of Jews, which in turn seems to be responsible for the assimilation of Jews. And how can we make sense of all of that? Clearly, secular education is not the source of assimilation, since well-educated Jews remain attached to the Jewish community. The evidence available points unmistakably to the absence of any systematic relationship between years of education and types of Jewish expression, religious or ethnic. In the past, however, education was associated with a decline in Jewishness. The data also show that Jewish education is not deteriorating, since so many young and older Jewish adults are obtaining some kind of education, sometimes a superior Jewish education, in a wide range of institutions and in diverse packaging. I suggest that the most important context to understand American Jews and their educational patterns starts with a focus on community, not on individuals. Community is the most powerful source of Jewish continuity in America, as it has been in the past. And an analysis of Jewish and secular education will bring us to a new understanding of the quality of American Jewish life and a basis for growth in the future. There are two important points to stress about education in the past. Educational attainment in the past was not just the path toward social mobility. Education certainly led to better jobs, higher incomes, escape from the poverty of the unskilled and skilled labor of parents, and in turn, the neighborhoods and networks that consisted of the foreign-born. Education was a means to escape from the associations of foreignness with a foreign language, a foreign culture, foreign parents. For many, it was an escape from Jewishness and Judaism. In short, education was the path to becoming American, but required leaving the community. We have almost always celebrated this path among Jews with pride in our group's accomplishment. When children and grandchildren become doctors and lawyers, skilled businessmen, men and women and teachers, we thought that was the Jewish thing to do. But in those early years, there was a cost. The cost was for Judaism and Jewishness, and more importantly, for relationships between generations. Although parents encouraged their children to obtain a high level of education, the lifestyle associated with higher education often meant the disruption and conflict between parents and children who had different educational levels, and between siblings and peers who had different access to educational opportunities. Who hasn't read about or experienced the ways in which educational attainment was disruptive between parents and their grandparents, and between our grandparents and their parents? But looking beyond the costs generationally, we should now appreciate the value of education in the last 2 generations. Here, the emphasis or value on education has not lessened, but the opportunities have increased and spread. It is no longer disruptive of the generations, but in fact increases the similarities between the generations, removing the generation gap. So the meaning of 2 generations of college-educated Jews becomes not simply a note of group congratulations and pride, but a basis of intergenerational commonality, not only a changed relationship to Jewishness. Educational attainment has become a feature of families that's not disruptive within families, but points of sharing and common experience. So an analysis of educational attainment points to the increased power of families, the generational increase in resources, the common lifestyles that, far from dividing families, bind parents and children together, again, into a network of relationships. These emphases on education and achievement of family cohesion and values have become group traits, not only of individuals, that make the Jewish group attractive to others. Unlike in the past, when interaction of Jews with non-Jews and marriage between Jews and non-Jews was a mechanism of escape from Jewishness and foreignness, the Jewish group has now become attractive to others because of their family and communal traits, particularly education. Hence, like education, intermarriage cannot mean the same in the new context of generations as it did in the older context of rejection and escape. But what about the content of this generational commonality? What are the families sharing Jewishly? Are they sharing Jewish culture and Judaism? I want to turn to the question of religion and religiosity and of Judaism. And I want you to join me in a brief mental exercise. Think about the meaning of Judaism 200 years ago in parts of Eastern Europe where the majority of Jews in the world lived. Let's consider a social scientist who decided to take a survey of these communities and included on the survey a question about synagogue attendance, the frequency of attending religious services as an indicator of religiosity. In carrying out the statistical analysis of this survey, the social scientist is surprised by the following findings. First, almost no women attend synagogue services except in the very large cities, and then only occasionally. And secondly, many men do not attend services regularly at all, because they do not have a quorum of 10 people in their communities. Again, except for a few times a year when they're able to come to a larger town. Hence, almost all the synagogues are filled. So if you looked at synagogues, you would say they're filled to capacity. But not all people are able to attend daily or weekly services because they lived too far or lived in towns and locations where there was no basis for 10 men. Many Jews in the past lived in places where there were few synagogues and few people and almost no institutions. We have very poor histories of those places. They weren't big enough to create the institutions, to write the records for us to remember them. Most Jews were busy with the difficult task of making a living, surviving economically, and that took up most of their time and energy. This social scientist that I made up might also have observed that the bitter cold of the late fall in Eastern Europe, the absence of access, meant that other Jewish rituals in the annual Jewish calendar, building a sukkah, buying a lulav and etrog, other ritual objects were just out of reach for most people. Even giving charity was limited by the economic resources available. Too many Jews were poor. So climate, geographic access, leisure time were constraining factors in the expressions of Judaism 200 years ago. The picture is not very much different when you look at Jewish education. Few persons were educated Jewishly 200 years ago. There were few Jewish schools, no adequate Jewish curriculum, and the tutors and teachers were themselves poorly educated. If judged by partial and anecdotal evidence, these teachers were often more a discouragement to education than a stimulus to knowledge. If truth be told, even much of the Jewish education of a generation or two ago in the United States was a major turnoff to thousands of American youngsters for the same reason. Most Jewish men and women in the beginning of the 19th century were not literate in any language, and even if Jews could afford Jewish books, there were few to be purchased, few could read them. 200 years ago, Jews were living in a Jewish cultural wasteland. So at least in terms of synagogue attendance, the depths of Jewish literacy and Jewish education, and even the observance of some public religious rituals, Jews in America by the end of the 20th century were doing not bad. We, of course, would not conclude that 2 centuries ago Jews were not religious or didn't value Jewish education or that their communities were eroding. Correctly, the historians would admonish me for presenting such superficial historical comparisons. The comparisons are distorting, they would say, because formal Jewish education, synagogue attendance, ritual observance were limited by the resources available and by the absence of choice. In the home and within families, Jews were committed to their Judaism as much as circumstances permitted. Those are powerful arguments, since they highlight the centrality of family and community in the development of Judaism and in the quality of Jewish life. In the home. Identical points could be made about contemporary American Judaism and about Jewish education. American Jewish communities are not confronted with the same constraints of the past, but there are new constraints and newly defined pressures that operate in similar ways, limiting the exposure to Jewish education and the performance of some religious rituals. At the same time, new forms of communication and technologies bring Judaism to far remote areas of the country and from distant places to the homes of American Jews. And new Jewish rituals, Jewish craft fairs, annual Jewish Federation meetings, pooling together federations representing hundreds of localities in the United States, celebrations for Israel Independence Day and Holocaust Memorial Day, and even some special lectures on Jewish themes in universities. Dot our calendars as never before, replacing some public rituals of the past. Just look at your own annual calendar to witness the enormous range of impressive Jewish activities that your community is involved in. I would argue that religious ritual observances, formal Jewish education, attending religious services are no more and no less valid indicators of contemporary Judaism than of Judaism 200 years ago. Then the work Jews did, the jobs they had, the institutions they created, and their cultural forms, the shared totality reinforced a sense of distinctiveness and community of the Jews. So it is in America today. What we lack is the constraints imposed by non-Jews in the past who didn't allow Jews to be anything but Jews. So we have choice, which is an advantage, not a disadvantage. The numbers show that most Jews in the late 1990s share Jewish holidays and ritual occasions with other Jews. Passover, Hanukkah, high holidays are the most popular. They share commitments to the state of Israel. They share giving charity to Jewish causes. Most see other Jews as their closest friends. Many work with other Jews, attend Jewish institutions, and want to provide some Jewish education to their children to transmit Jewish culture to the next generation. And in general, consider being Jewish one of the most important things in their lives. Indeed, in the minds of American Jews, being Jewish in some form is one of the most expressed and deeply felt values. Commonality of religious affiliation, similarities between parents and children, between the generations, reinforces the activities, the Jewish activities created in the home. What's the content of our Jewish institutions? What makes them Jewish and not something else? The answer is straightforward. The selective construction of the past, institutions construct history and cultural memory, just as families and generations in the past constructed Jewish culture and Jewish religion. It is the community, the networks, the shared lifestyles, the values and concerns of American Jews that bind them together. The form and content are radically different today than in the past. What's critical in terms of continuity is community and the institutions that shape it. Institutions are the visible and conspicuous symbols of Jewish culture and the basis of Jewish communal activities. And it is the generations in the home that form the basis of continuing those cultural forms. In contemporary America, the evidence suggests that it matters for Jewish continuity if there are Jewish-based institutions, Jewish schools and Jewish libraries, Jewish homes for the aged, if there are Jewish community centers, and if there are many and diverse temples and synagogues in our communities. Playing golf together with others in a Jewish country club, swimming at a Jewish community center, or even playing softball, or using daycare facilities in a Jewish institutional setting do not seem on the surface to be very Jewish, but they are. They're part of that total round of activity that makes for a total community of intertwined networks. These, quote, secular activities can enhance the values of Jewish life, intensify shared commitments, increase the social, family, and economic networks that sustain the continuity of the Jewish community. Using Jewish institutions to create networks sets up the potential to improve the quality of Jewish life and to ensure its continuity. It's these activities, not only the formal educational ones, not only the formal religious ritual ones, that are what is meant by community. Indeed, our studies show that the secular activities of Jewish life reinforce the religious and vice versa because so many Jews participate in them. The intensities often go together because they lead to the same place, the Jewish community. And it is the community that shapes the lives and future of Jews in America as it had in the past. Haven't the religious changes, however, resulted in secularization? Let's consider another briefer mental exercise, moving us back in time even further. Imagine a period of time, a generation after the destruction of the temple where there are no animal sacrifices were being brought. Some rabbis began to argue that prayer might substitute for animal sacrifice. Some rabbis were no doubt arguing that the prayer substitute wasn't working. Certainly the sociologists of that era, measuring the changing rituals that Jews were practicing, were realizing that the measures of ritual in the animal sacrifice days were no longer measuring the nature of religious activity. The priests, the Kohanim, of the times were concerned about the decline of Jewish ritual. That was their business, to take care of these animal sacrifices. There were probably social scientists that were arguing about transformation, not decline. Those sociologists, I like to think of them as the rabbis of the Talmud, that's a joke, were replacing sacrifice with prayer and priests with rabbis. The transforming experience of Judaism that was not based on animal sacrifice was probably rejected by many. Some historians at that time would have argued that things have changed and the end of the Jewish people was here, or at least there was a decline in religiosity. In our longer view, it's clear that the transformation saved Judaism from certain demise. If Judaism was only personal and individual, Israeli Jews would be facing a similar crisis since they too are secular. But the strength of Israeli Jews is not in religion. Indeed, religion is enormously divisive in the state of Israel among Jews. But the strength of the Jewish component in Israel are the institutions and associations of everyday life. Israel is a strong Jewish community, not because of marriage, not because of their great religious commitments, but because the power of its communities and the role of families. The collective nationalism and culture sustains families when religion is divisive. It is, in fact, an indication, an example, an illustration of extensive interaction totally among Jews in jobs, schools, the military, and neighborhoods. By establishing Jewish institutions, our gathering places for learning, study, and prayer for social and cultural activities, we reaffirm our Jewish distinctiveness not as individuals, not only as families, but as a community. For individuals pass away, families are formed and reformed, but institutions can have continuity over many generations and beyond the lives of people who set them up and support them. We are distinctive as a Jewish community because our institutions are distinctive. The institutions create the basis of communal activity. We construct our communities, our families, our friends around these institutions, and in the process, we create community. So our prayer comes together in our public places, our collective goals, our communal bonds, our commitments to survive. Only those ethnic and religious groups in America that develop institutions have survived. In large part, that's because institutions inform us who we are in history and in culture and inform our neighbors who we are as well. Our institutions are surely constructed in different ways now than in the past, but they serve the same goals. We create institutions, federations, hillels, synagogues, temples, schools, Jewish community centers, museums, Holocaust foundations, and we invest in them and expand them. We serve on their boards. They provide major benefits to the community. From an organizational goal point of view, we as a Jewish community are very over-organized. And we bemoan the duplication. From a community point of view, these institutions define the nature of Jewish culture, Jewish creativity, and Jewish continuity. The old joke about the shipwrecked Jew who had built a synagogue that he attended and one that he didn't attend symbolizes the tremendous capacity of Jews to build Jewish life, even as we joke about it among ourselves. Now, once we begin to have this notion of this orientation of the past, I want to consider very briefly a few themes that we need to reckon with in order to understand the American Jewish community. And I'll do this somewhat briefly and then give you at least some time to think about it and to raise some questions. First, categorizing Jews as Jews in the core and Jews on the periphery, as was done in all the formal reports of the population studies, is to do more than to establish a classification scheme. It is the social construction of the margins of the community to culturally polarize and to justify policy initiatives directed at the core and not the periphery. The Chief Rabbi of Great Britain calls this Jewish Darwinism. Only the fittest Jews survive, therefore only they are deserving of policy support. What's missing from our studies and what's missing from our orientation is that we are much too concerned with individual identity. We've rarely focused on collecting information and thinking about family networks in our Jewish surveys. We've collected data on marriage and intermarriage, but rarely on children who are not living at home. We've argued theoretically for the power of networks as a basis for continuity among ethnic populations, but we've paid almost no attention to how we get information about Jewish networks. We argue about generations without focusing on them. How do we take into account transformation in the way we think about and study Jewish communities? We've incorporated in our surveys, and appropriately so, measures of the intensity of religious expression. What Jewish surveys have not included questions on lighting candles on Friday night, or Hanukkah, or Passover Seder celebrations? On the basis of these and similar ritual questions, we've concluded something about changes and variation in religious activities of Jews. We've also drawn conclusions about the decline of Jewishness and secularization. But what would happen if the only information we had about what Judaism was the survey questionnaire? If that was our Judaic text, and we said, here is our text, this will tell you what Judaism is, we would have a very distorted view of what Judaism is. If the survey questionnaire were our Judaic text, first we would conclude that some religious rituals are more important than others. Is candle lighting, which we collect information on, more important than doing good deeds, which we never collect information on? Is it more important than having a Friday night dinner with family or visiting the sick? We don't ask those questions either. The rabbis of the Talmud couldn't prioritize among the commandments. How arrogant of social scientists to do so. How distorting to assert that we understand contemporary Judaism by examining the results of our surveys. Have we distorted our views about those Jews on the periphery, in quotes, by measuring whether they publicly attend the synagogue regularly or whether they light candles on Friday night? Do we dismiss their seders on Passover and Hanukkah celebrations by noting that they're only occasions for family get-togethers? And Hanukkah is only an attempt to find holidays that parallel other celebrations in America. Where are our Jewish institutions in our data, in our information? If networks are entirely missing, where do we put Jewish institutions? Of course we include whether they belong to the Federation. Of course we include whether they give charity to the Federation. But do we ask whether living in a community that has a Jewish community center or a Jewish home for the aged matter for the quality of Jewish life? Do we find out in our survey whether Jewish daycare strengthens Jewish networks and community? Does our emphasis on national Jewish studies mask the rich diversity among Jewish communities? And finally, we need information to evaluate Jewish education, not just to study how many years and in what types of institutions people obtain their education. I've often argued that the quality of a university course is how much the instructor learns. And I would argue that the quality of Jewish education, especially for those at the younger ages, is how much the parents learn. As far as I know, we've never asked that question in any community survey for the Jewish community anywhere. We need to study our families to see how they strengthen our communities. We need to begin systematic studies of blended families, reconstituted families, intermarried families, not couples, families, step families and their children. Focusing on families reminds us that the family is the unit where generational continuities are critical, but the family is radically changing. On the continuity side, the family is where Judaism has always put its emphasis, not only in terms of generations, but in terms of the division of labor within the household and between the generations. Family continues to mean children and family networks. But on the other hand, there are radical changes in the family. So divorce and remarriage and singlehood all represent challenges to the Jewish community. Think of college students in the 21st century who are more likely than not to attend colleges away from home for long periods of time and before they marry. Think of widowhood, where women are likely to spend significant numbers of years living alone. Think of step-parenthood and reconstituted and blended families that require new ways to reconfigure the power of family relationships. Clearly, we can retain the notion of family bases of Judaism as long as we expand the definition of the family. We obviously cannot retain the family basis of Judaism with the conception of the family of a century ago. We need to find ways to strengthen relationships to our community by our new families. We're entering a new century and a new millennium. Continuity with the past is limited when our communities have changed so drastically. We should be focusing on community. We should be focusing on families. Why are we diverting our energies from these grand questions about Judaism and Jewishness of our homes to obsess about biology? Whatever the message the American Jewish community thinks it's sending to the next generation of our Jewish community, most of them hear the following. We Jews are great musicians. Your grandparents were musicians, as were their parents before them. For centuries, our people have made the most extraordinary music. Therefore, the number one concern of our community is that whomever you marry should have a mother who is a musician. These young people are smart and perplexed by the message. We don't get it, they say. There was relatively little music in our home when we were growing up. A couple of times a year we went to big concerts where we didn't know the score. We enjoy hearing the music from time to time, even though we can barely read a note. But if music is so important to our community, why is it that the only thing I hear them talking about is whether or not my potential mother-in-law is a musician? Our Jewish families and our Jewish institutions, our homes and our communities have been the Jewish music of our lives. I hope that we and our children and our children's children will learn to play this music and contribute to this great Jewish symphony. Thank you. All those musicians in the audience, I apologize for the analogy. We have some time, and I probably have a little bit of energy left, and I'm happy to listen to questions or clarifications. Please come to the microphone. Go ahead, come to the microphone. You'll finally get a chance to ask your question.
In both the first and on this presentation, you've stressed the fact that the social scientists have been asking the wrong question. What has been the vested interest of the social sciences in doing so?
Would you like to rephrase that question? That's a very tough question for a social scientist to answer. I'm not sure that they have vested interests. I think you give them much too much credit. I think that there is, within the Jewish community, both in the United States and elsewhere, a set of theoretical assumptions that they make about what's important. One set of assumptions, and I sort of alluded to that in the beginning, is a set of assumptions which says that the diaspora will not continue. The theory is there is no hope for diaspora. We will look at the evidence and show you that it won't continue. I've often used the illustration. I may have used it here before or in one of the other presentations that I made that I can't remember now. In 1970, when there was a 1970 Jewish population study, the late Golda Meir announced from Toronto that the national Jewish population of 1970 indicated that 37% of the Jews in the youngest cohort were marrying. And everybody was shocked, was intermarrying, sorry. 37% of the younger cohort were intermarrying, and this is really harkens the end of the Jewish people. And Golda Meir said this. And I often wondered, what kind of social scientist was Golda Meir? She was a prime minister of the state of Israel, but certainly not a social scientist. And her objective was not to convey a statistic, but to convey an ideology. I was struck by this figure and went back to check what proportions were intermarrying for that younger cohort and found out that the number of cases that that figure was based on was 12. She did not mention that. That was not in the footnotes in the press release. She was conveying an ideology. So one theme that informs Jewish communal leaders and Jewish Federation leaders and people who run surveys is we'll sort of ask these questions over and over again. That's what it is. This is what it's about. Why ask them again? One of the puzzling things I've always asked in the American Jewish community in the state of Israel when they do surveys is, why are you asking these questions again and again, over and over again, when the questions you're asking are inappropriate, you can't answer them properly, they give you no information? Why ask them? And their answer is comparability. We can compare from one to the other, right? So I say, if you do that, that's sort of silly. So one notion is social scientists sort of do what they've done in the past, and if they've done it, we'll know what the changes are. So I think that one is this sort of ideology. One is the notion of another theme, without carrying on, but not a vested interest. I wouldn't put it in those terms. The National Science, Jewish federations fund it, and Jewish federations are, again, come with a notion that if things are very good, then nobody's going to give money to the federation. If there's a crisis, if things are bad, if there are 12 Syrian Jews that are in crisis, we have to raise several $1 million to get them out. You run out of Syrian Jews, you'll go elsewhere. If you run out of memory, if you run out of Holocaust museums, we'll have to figure out there's a crisis in Israel. So crisis is a kind of word which generates, so they think, money. It also protects them against defining Jewish quality. Because if the heads of these umbrella organizations begin to define Jewish quality, they're going to begin to find that the community is not homogeneous. What's good for one community may not be good for another. The Orthodox will say this is where it is. The Reform will say something else. The secular non-affiliated says give us the money so we can have Jewish hot tubs. I don't know, but the point is that there are competing interests. So if you want to smooth it over, if you want to say let's have one kind of Jewish community, the notion in 10 years ago, we are one, right? Well, they dropped that now, right? They decided we aren't one anymore, so we can't really talk about it. So they've dropped that formally dropped that as a phrase to characterize Jewish communities. Because we aren't one. But I don't see that when we aren't one, that's divisive. I think that the notion of competition within a community might be very powerful. We think it's good in other arenas, so it's not so terrible outside if you're competing. So I think there aren't vested interests, but there are people who are deciding this is what the community needs to know. The number of questions asked on the National Jewish Population Survey in 1990 were something like 300 and some questions. I figured that there would be at least 15 or 20 dissertations that could be written. And the only figure that almost every Jewish community knows about is the 52%, which is a wrong figure anyway, which has been revised and rejected by the community, but that's the figure they remember of intermarriage. So the point is that that's, again, to convey not anything except a ideology, if not an orientation. One of the interesting thoughts that you may want to think about, what would happen if the results of the national survey finds that 90% of Jews marry other Jews, born Jews, and all the Jews don't care about being Jewish, right? So that 90% of the Jews marry Jews, and nobody cares about being Jewish at all. Would we have a crisis? I don't think so. I think so. They wouldn't define that as a crisis, okay? So I don't think that they would have defined that as a crisis. So crisis is a matter of how they want to construct what it is to generate what their goal is, in part, to sustain themselves as an institution. If you have no problems, why are you collecting money? Yes, sir.
A new addition to the mix are Jewish websites. So what is your opinion of them and all the hits they're on?
Listen, in Seattle, for me to come out against Jewish websites is sort of to cut my own throat, right? Jewish websites are astounding, really astounding. The amount of information that's conveyed in multiple forms of Jewish websites is really mind-boggling. Okay? There are available on websites an enormous amount of material, enormous amounts of material, enormous amounts of information, and people use it. For the first time in courses that I teach at Brown University this year, I would say half the students writing, quote, research papers only had websites as the basis of the information they had. They don't look at books anymore, which has its pluses and minuses, right? If you write books, then nobody is buying them, you're really in trouble, right? But websites are powerful information. They're also powerful forms of communication. I find out on a daily basis what's happening in the state of Israel by reading the Hebrew and English newspapers in Israel. Everybody can do it. It's online. You can find the information. If you have a question of why is it that this product or that product isn't kosher, send a letter to the rabbi over the internet. Within a day, you'll get an answer. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, but you'll get an answer. Powerful information. Some misinformation as well. Those people who study religious texts and those people who study biblical texts will find an enormous resource to find the entire Talmud available on the web. The entire, certainly all of Tanakh, all of the Hebrew Bible, all the books of the Bible are there, and enormous amounts of other materials that are available for research purposes and for learning and so on. So there's an enormous explosion with an enormous amount of information unthought of 10 years ago. And this is available to a lot of people. If you want to find out the impact of this, just go to small communities which don't have very many Jews or very many Jewish institutions, small communities that dot the United States and around the world, and people are on the web learning about things Jewish in amazing amounts of information. So Jewish education, then, can't be confined to the young, can't be confined to the first couple of grades, has to be thought of much more broadly. That's where we have to begin to think more creatively when we say, what's the nature of Jewish education? We haven't studied it, but my guess is it's a fantastic resource that will be very useful in the future. So we think about futures, that's how we have to think about it. What number? The intermarriage rate. What is the exact number? The latest evidence suggests that when you look at the data correctly, it's much closer to about 43, 44%. There's no comfort in the fact that 44% is intermarriage rate. I want to emphasize again that the issue is not marriage. The issue is not who gets married, but what happens to the kids, what happens in the home, where is the Jewish home. So that figure doesn't say anything to me. It says to me, let's figure out what's going on. And if we don't figure out what's going on, we don't have very much access to the way in which the Jewish community is operating. Yes, ma'am.
Hello again.
Hi. Your question is profound. I said it to you twice, so I'm not going to say it again. Go
I
ahead.
won't ask a profound one this time. What the concept of the community using crisis and trouble as a rallying point has been of concern to me for many, many years, and I'm so glad to hear you say it. What is the effect sociologically on communities that begin to identify around their common cause something that is fragility and negativeness as opposed to robustness and health? What if you're always taking echinacea and St. John's wort and every other thing that's on the thing, but you're never out actually enjoying your health? And how can we switch that sort of mindset in American Jewry around? It feels to me that it's sort of doing it on its own. But what more is there that communities can do to make us realize what an affirming community we are?
Well, I think that's not a profound question, but a good question. It's a good question because what it says is that, on the one hand, Jewish communities really have a great deal of power. Even though it's a voluntary community and it's organized, there's an enormous amount of power of persuasion, a power of communication. Look how effective they are in convincing everybody that there's a crisis. And I think that if not only Jewish federations, but Jewish organizations take another point of view, we have a rich Jewish culture. There's a reason to survive. There's a reason to train our younger generation that there is a quality out there and that there is a rich Jewish history. And there's no reason why they can't use that as a basis for creative activity. I think that message would be much more a message that would be received. It would be a message that would generate all kinds of activities that are much healthier for a community and much more consistent with the nature of the communities that we indeed have. So I think that the crisis that we're going to be falling apart, that there's a Holocaust, pick up a stone and you'll find an anti-Semite, so you have to get rid of anti-Semitism, we fear them, just doesn't work anymore in America. It hardly works anywhere else. And Israel is no longer the utopian vision that may have once been long, long time ago. It's a real society with all of its great qualities and all of its blemishes together. So I would urge the community to celebrate what we have and to build on it and to build on that strength rather than being negative, because I don't think that you can build much on negative, certainly for the younger generation.